I'm here with David McRaney. David is a science journalist, author, and podcaster. He wrote 2 books about logical fallacies and cognitive biases. One is titled You Are Not So Smart, and the other is You Are Now Less Dumb. And he hosts one of my favorite podcasts, the You Are Not So Smart podcast. We'll get into this. I subscribe to 5 podcasts total, and yours is one of them.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
He recently published a book called How Minds Change. And while all of his previous work is on the table for discussion, I think we'll center today's talk around how minds change, which I would hold up to show you if I could, but I got the audio version this time, which is, it was nice to hear your voice reading.
There we go. There's a physical book that does exist. So, yep.
Perfect.
David, you listen to the audiobook. How's that working out for you? I didn't get a chance to do the audiobook for my first 2 books. And I got to go into the studio, spend a week in there. Some days like 6-7 hours. How did it land for you?
Well, at the level of the reader or listener, it was great. I'll always love listening to the author's voice. And you, I'll probably get into this, but I know Anthony Magnabosco, and you had a whole chapter on him. I was thinking it was funny. It would be so soothing to hear you 2 in conversation. You have really similar temperaments and voice, laid back. Anyway, it made the experience good, and I always enjoy hearing the author read his book.
Oh, that's great. We'll start an ASMR channel or something.
At a meta level, I've written books, and I'm doing audiobook versions for them now. I was behind the ball in getting the audio version set up. Small publisher, we didn't do it right away, and it's so tedious. So I don't know how that process was for you, but for me, it
was tough. It was tough because this is a book that has a lot of people's names, a lot of pronunciations, a lot of scientific terms, but more than anything, this book is on the ground, and a lot of it is dialogue, things that I said and things that people said back to me. And there's a sweet spot where you don't want to act, you don't go into full like, and hello, and now you're trying to do voices or anything, but you also want the reader to guide the reader in a lot of ways. And we put a lot of work into that. And we also put a lot of work into, there's the sections of the book that are deeply emotional for me.
Sure.
And we would have to take breaks for those things. And then there are moments in the book where I'm speaking on behalf of people who have said heinous, terrible things or believe things that are very harmful, and playing their role as I'm speaking them. There's a lot of tough stuff there. So it was great. It was a great experience. It really helped for this stage of everything where I'm eager to tell people about the book, because you read your own book out loud for 8 hours a day. It helps you remember where you were and how everything went. So yeah, it's quite an experience.
Something I like about it, if I can jump in, is I love your podcast. I've read one of your books, but I don't remember which one it was previously. And, talking about cognitive biases, logical fallacies is interesting enough. I feel like this book you amped it up a level, because talking about fallacies is something that people can reason. But a lot of times I talk to people about the logical fallacies we have, and maybe sometimes I recognize some of my own, but for the most part, the discussions I have about them with intelligent people are like, look at all those idiots with cognitive dissonance out there. Isn't it funny that we can rise above them? This was more of, and you even said it in the introduction, you've changed your beliefs were fluid along the way, and you changed your mind throughout the book. And you were interested in how minds change in general, not just the structures by which we form beliefs, not just heuristics and how to kick those or overcome them, but more in general, how do minds change, including your own? So I found that an interesting.
Yeah, I there's a lot of comeuppance. In the book, I didn't intend for that to be something that was going to be talked about so much in the book, that I changed my own mind in the process. But when I started the book, I had been proselytizing for forever, and had You Are Not So Smart and the books that go along with it. And a lot of times I was just in that same frame where I was talking about describing the ways in which we are unable to reach the ways in which we rationalize and justify and explain things, basically motivated reasoning. And as I say in the book, I was at a lecture once, and someone came up and asked about their father who had fallen into a conspiracy theory and wanted to know how to get them out of it. And I said, well, you can't. And it felt like locking my keys in my car. I was like, this doesn't feel, I don't like what I'm saying. And I don't know if I really feel like that's something I've explored deeply enough to give that kind of advice. And I didn't like the advice. And also at the same time that happened, the norms and then the laws concerning same-sex marriage in the United States had very quickly changed. If you weren't part of that change, it was, if you weren't an activist, it almost felt like it happened overnight, but it did happen very quickly, even if you were part of it over the course of about 12 years, after many years of struggle. But after about 12 years, the norms flipped. And then when they flipped in about 3 years. From the majority of the country opposed to same-sex marriage to the majority of the country in favor. And I just wanted to understand, like, okay, if you were to take all those people who are now in that new majority and put them in a time machine and send them back 10 years, wouldn't they argue with themselves if they would say, here's what I believe and here's what I believe? You would. And so what happened in their brains in the interim? I wanted to understand that at the level of brains and maybe work my way up. And then I could understand how minds change in general. And then in that, maybe there would be advice for myself and others about how to reach out to people. And I was very fortunate to find to be approached by Hugo Mercier, part of Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, the interactionist model, and also Tom Stafford, the truth wins scenario. And that's sort of the peanut butter and chocolate of my comeuppance in the book. The one, we can get into it, but one is about how we both produce and evaluate arguments, and we are set up to change our minds. If we're set up to produce biased and lazy reasoning, but that doesn't mean that it's flawed and irrational reasoning, or that it's irrational to think in that way. And the other is that reasoning in isolation, which is mostly what happens in scientific studies. Most of the studies that people write about, most of the studies that I was writing about, people are being studied in isolation as individuals, where you commit a certain type of reasoning that can be very biased. It looks very flawed also. But if you allow people to discuss things with each other and present their reasoning to one another and pick it apart, you find that a lot of the research that showed that we were bad at this stuff shows that we're just bad at it as individuals. We're much better at it in groups. So those two things together became engines of trying to talk about this whole topic. And then all along the way, just I didn't even want to get into the persuasion stuff. I didn't want to get into persuasion at all. I really didn't want to write a book that was like how to win friends and influence people. I'd never intended there to even be persuasion in the book that much. But I met a bunch of groups of people who were really great at it, and they all were doing pretty much the same thing. So I only get into that around page 200. And leading up to that, I want you to understand really deeply, like, what's going on, how do brains update, no matter where the updating is coming from. And then we'll get into how you could influence that in a one-to-one or one-to-many interaction. So yeah, I changed my mind a lot writing this book. I grew a lot as a person and as a writer. And I really wanted it to be not like my other books, which are literature from the scientific literature explained to you in a fun and funny way, cheeky way, almost Wikipedia with jokes when you get down to it. I wanted it to be, no, this is new, fresh, on the ground, in-person journalism. So I really appreciate the feedback.
And I believe you that you changed your mind. It would be, you could imagine an author that feels like it would be nice fodder for a book to say. And well, I have a friend, Johan Hari, who writes a lot of books, ton of
I met Johan.
He's a great guy, but every time he gives I tease him about this, every time he gives a presentation to the millions or whatever, he says, went on this remarkable journey. And I was so surprised to learn. I said, hey man, we were talking about this 3 years ago before you wrote your book and you thought that then. But anyway, I would love to stick within the framework of the of people's outlook on, say, gay marriage.
Okay.
What does you mentioned? You wondered, well, what happened through the course of that huge social change? When people look back and said, well, I was opposed to gay marriage then. What is going on through people's mind? I know everyone's going to be different, but what is that phenomenon that allows them to reduce dissonance in that way?
Well, I mean, I'm going to try to not remember the entire book and just say it back out loud to you again. I'll say it. I think before we even talk about it, we have to understand that the two engines by which brains update themselves, the assimilation and accommodation. So this comes from the work of Jean Piaget, but since then his course has been that he was doing that before we had neuroscience and MRIs. But it all still checks out. I love this. This was a great gift. I think I actually, do I have the book here? Um, I think I brought the book to bed, honestly. No, I didn't. It's right here. Oh my God. Look at this, fantastic. The Principles of Genetic Epistemology. His insanely easy to read book about um, where assimilation accommodation came from. Of course, Piaget, most people, if you took a lot of psych classes, you know, he's the one who was studying how children make sense of the world in stages, and why they think that, and it still works on adults too, why they think that a tall glass has more in it than a short glass. That still works, by the way. If you've ever been to a bar, if you go to Chili's, they're going to give you that tall glass and go, oh, look at all the liquor we just gave you. So it still works. He was studying all that because he wanted to understand how the layers and layers of abstraction that you would consider knowledge form in the mind. And most modern pedagogical stuff, like learning techniques, teaching techniques, they all come from this. Assimilation is when you're trying to take information that's new and novel and ambiguous and fit it into your existing models. And oftentimes that's at the expense of learning something about it or changing, because you're saying, oh, that exactly is what I expected to see. I'm interpreting it in a certain way. That interpretation is, this matches what I already understand. Accommodation, on the other hand, is when you must expand the range of your understanding to accommodate the new information, because the novelty is too anomalous after a certain point. The easier way to look at this is like when a child sees a dog for the first time, you'll point at it and you'll say, oh yeah, that's a dog. And they're like, dog, they learn the word dog, but something categorical takes place in their brain, which is small, or I will take it back. Something categorical, just so that my explanation fits. 4 legs, furry, tail, non-human. Okay, later on they see a horse, they may point at it and say dog. They might even say big dog, which is an attempt to assimilate into their current understanding. But if you say, no, that's a horse, well, something categorical must take place where they have to create a category in which the dog and the horse both can go, which is a new category. They may not have a name for it, but it's going to be something like animal or creature. And it seemed okay. It's a non-human 4-legged furry thing. It should be dog, but you said no, horse. Okay, there are variations here. So to do that, we must accommodate. Brains are doing this all the time, assimilating and accommodating. We're doing it in this conversation. Like you told me a little bit about Johann. I assimilated some of that, but then I had to accommodate some of that. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We're always doing that. So at some level, at some point, the models and the schemas are so complex that you start walking a tightrope of adaptation. When new novel information comes along, if you change your mind, you might become wrong. But if you don't change your mind, you might stay wrong. So where do I step on the tightrope? We usually favor at a baseline resistance, because or whatever we thought, felt, and believed got us to this point. So, but there are other motivating factors that will increase that resistance. So usually you just need a little bit more counterfactual, counter-attitudinal information, and you'll go, okay, I should change my mind if it's neutral. But most things aren't neutral. And you can take flat earthers as a good example. That seems like a neutral thing. Is the earth flat? Seems kind of apolitical, seems neutral. But for a certain portion of our vast collection of humans in society, that is not a neutral topic. That is a topic that is infused with identity, group identity. It is infused with social costs and social rewards for thinking and feeling a certain way. They become a community and so now they're much more motivated. So the baseline resistance goes up. When it comes to same-sex marriage, that is also what was true for a lot of people in the United States. Most of the people who were opposed came from where I grew up, which is the deep South United States, the Bible Belt, places throughout the Middle America where Christian conservatism had formed a cultural norm that opposed same-sex everything, all LGBTQ issues. And that was just true for a number of religious communities. And then there was also this sort of hyper-masculinity concept that was all throughout the United States that was a overall cultural norm. And there's all these cultural reasons that people resisted it, and these thoughts of what kind of social costs they would incur for flipping. And also they didn't have much contact with people who were LGBTQ. There was a real push for people to be in the closet and to avoid the harm that could come from them, both either from losing their jobs or getting hurt. And the there's all sorts of reasons how there's all sorts of ways that the brain updated individually in that situation. But for it to sweep across the country, what had to take place was something called a cascade. Um, Originally, this was what the whole book was going to be about, cascades. But the more I got into it, the more, and there's about 40,000 words of the manuscript that are cut out that I'll put somewhere on a newsletter or something. But and the great Greg Sittel wrote a good book about cascades toward the end of my process. So if you want to learn more about that, he's got a book all about it. But here's the short version of that, and then I'll end my long answer.
No, good. This is good.
Okay, cool. Because I'm the kind of, a podcast, so I'll just one question and I'll just talk for the next 45 minutes. The easiest way to let me give you the big model of it and then give you a simple example. Human networks are, if you think of it in terms of relationships, in terms of connections, you can almost look at it like a molecule model that you would see in the chemistry class. Like you have these little balls that have the atoms, and then you have the sticks that are the bonds between them, and you end up with this nice sculpture looking thing. Well, imagine that as being extremely complex and vast, and each ball is a node in the network, and that's one human being. And all the lines that spread out that connect to other human beings, and those connections can be strong or weak. Strong is like, someone who help you move, give you a kidney. Weak would be somebody who, you email or something like that, or you just basically know. And those networks become very vast. And they also cluster into units where people who are strongly bonded have a couple of links out to other networks of people who are strongly bonded. So when it comes to something like a rumor, that can spread virally. That's where things like the tipping point have all of their play. But none of that applies to changing your mind. None of that really applies, because we don't change our minds virally, because there's a threshold of conformity that must be overcome. A virus, you just have to have contact, and you catch it, you pass it on. Same with certain ideas. But when it comes to changing your mind, that resistance that we're talking about has to be overcome. And all of us have different thresholds of resistance when it comes to very particular issues, particular attitudes, particular values, particular beliefs. And one great example of seeing how this can cascade as a change is, you can think of because this has happened to me before. You're trying to get into a classroom, in college, and there's just a bunch of people waiting to get in, and you just join them, and then the door opens up, and the professor's like, "What are you doing?" And the class is totally empty, and everybody goes, they all run in. So how does this happen? Well, the first person that arrives who sees a door that is closed, they have what they would call an internal signal versus an external signal. The external signal is door closed. The internal signal is all their experiences they're bringing to the situation. They may have a lot of social anxiety. They may have tried to open a door once in the past, and there was a classroom in there. They were embarrassed. There could be all sorts of things that they bring to the situation that forms their internal signal, which is going to be the level of their resistance to opening that door. So they stop and start playing on their phone because they're like, I'll just wait till the class is ready. Well, the second person that shows up, they have all their internal stuff too, but now the external signal includes a person waiting to get inside, and they must assume, well, they know something I don't. And you'd have to have a very high threshold of non-conformity, or low threshold for conformity, to say, I'm just going to walk past that person and look. But some people do. But let's say that person that shows up isn't that kind of person. Well, they go, I'll wait too. Once there are just two people waiting to get in, there are very few people who will show up and go, I'll just check, because it seems like two people must know what's up. Maybe they even talk to each other. So that external signal is really strong. And now the cascade is almost guaranteed, because person 3 is going to go, okay, I'm going to wait too. And if you see 3 people waiting, you're going to wait. And maybe someone could come along who's just a totally rebellious, subversive punk person who'd be like, I don't care what people think. I'm going to check for myself. I'm busy. Or maybe their internal signal is very strong. They need to get in that class. It's very important to them. But typically what's going to happen is 3 is going to become 4, become 5, and it's just going to, and then all of a sudden everybody's doing something based purely off this. That's how a cascade happens. And it's also when the new information is added, is how the cascade ends, right? That can happen for behavior that you want to do, or behavior that you don't want to do. In either way, that it's like influencing how you decided to behave in the world. And this also can happen like when the way parties empty out. If anyone's listening and wondered why this happens, where you're at a party and all of a sudden everybody just leaves, you're like, what did I, especially if you're hosting the party, same thing. It's thresholds of conformity. Like
Yeah.
the first few people wanted, like maybe one person wants to leave because they have something they want to do tomorrow, but there's one other person who wanted to leave, but they needed somebody else to leave. And so when that person leaves, they're like, thank God I can leave now. And so they leave. Two people leave, and there are other people who are like, two people left. That makes me feel kind of strange for sticking around. And now then there are three, the people. So what you end up with, people who are the early adopters lead to the people who will conform. And then that creates a larger group of conformity. And eventually the conformity becomes so strong that everybody conforms and everybody's gone. You're like, what happened? This is also how this works with in the same-sex marriage situation, and also with everything like smoking norms, marijuana laws, gun control, abortion. These are all things that will be affected by this cascade effect, combined with this assimilation accommodation thing, along with the contact hypothesis. Contact changes minds simply because we don't know what we don't know, and we have to engage with people who are having different experiences than ours or have different knowledge about the world than ourselves. And you assume you do understand how the world works until you're confronted with evidence that maybe perhaps you don't. For many, one of the things that was very smart during the activism portion of the same-sex marriage and LGBTQ issues in general was coming out, really encouraging people to come out. Because once people had come out in large areas, people on started with like television and movies, encourage people in more liberally minded places to come out. Those people influenced other people to come out, and people started seeing their friends, their family, their coworkers, people they interacted with were openly LGBTQ, and that influenced the thresholds for some people to think differently about how maybe the issue is. And in their social network, they become an example. They become that person, that ally becomes an external signal for other people who may become an ally. And what you end up with is this thing called the percolating local cluster. And this will be the last thing I say about this for this particular answer. This is one of my favorite things I've ever learned, period, in writing this book. I learned it from Duncan Watts. He has a great book that's pretty difficult and dense, but he was great. He sat down with me. He talked it all through. Here's the way he described what happens with vast networks change like this. It has nothing to do with mavens or connectors or highly influential people. Nothing. It has nothing to do with them. It's the susceptibility of the network to cascade.
Right.
So
right.
You imagine a forest, and a person drives down this forest road every day on the way to work, and they smoke a cigarette. At about the same time every day on that journey, they flick out the cigarette. It goes in the same spot pretty much every time. Bounce, 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 lands in the woods. We're assuming this person's not a very conscientious individual. And what happens? Nothing. It just lands, and then it extinguishes. But then one day, it lands in a particularly vulnerable spot that has become newly vulnerable somehow, starts a small fire. That small fire makes it more likely for the thing or things around it to catch fire. Those catch fire. That makes it more likely for the things around that to catch fire. And then it cascades. And now you have a fire that engulfs 7 counties. It was the same cigarette every day in the same spot, but the network had changed. And when the network became susceptible, it could have been anything. It could have been a firefighter strike. It could have been a particularly a drought conditions. It could have been a tree fell over at that spot, and it had never been there'd never been a tree there before, but it was just rotted enough for the leaves to catch fire, and that leads to the cascade. So the network has to be it has to land in what they call a percolating vulnerable cluster, and then that has to spread to the rest of the network, and that can happen. That vulnerable cluster is moving at all times throughout the network. The network is very unstable and chaotic, like the surface of the ocean. The connections between the individuals in a particular part of the network have to be lined up in just the right way. There has to be someone with a low threshold who encounters the thing. In this case, it would be someone who's an ally who may have been involved in something, and that flips them. Then when they flip, the people who are more likely to flip around them will flip in concert. That becomes a cluster of people who are flipped that become very influential to the people who have higher thresholds. They flip. Then the whole cluster will saturate. And that saturated cluster will then, all of the people connected to that cluster, the other clusters have a potential to have the same thing happen. And it is whooshes. And this ends up being, there's something called critical juncture theory that talks about this. I like to use punctuated equilibrium because I think a lot in terms of like biology. That's where more of my background's at. So in punctuated equilibrium, you can see on a long evolutionary time scale of human species, you have these vast long periods of status quo punctuated by rapid speciation. And then that happens continuously. And you can also see this seems to be what happens socially. We have these long periods of status quo where it seems like this is never going to change. People are never going to change their minds about this. America's always going to be like this, blah, 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 blah. And then in like 12 years, the whole thing flips. And I'm certain that can happen for literally anything. And it can happen in any direction, depending on the conditions, but it's the network that has to change. And I say toward the end of the book that if you want something to change in this world, like the persistence is very important and hopelessness is you have to avoid it because you can strike at that same thing over and over again, like that cigarette. But as Duncan Watts said, when the network was vulnerable, it could have been a cigarette, but it also could have been a lightning bolt, or it could have been a nuclear bomb. It didn't matter what did the striking. It just mattered that something did the striking. And that could be anyone who is eager to change the world. You have to just continuously strike the network and influence others to do the same. The more people striking, the more likely the cascade will occur.
You mentioned a system being vulnerable to change. I mean, that was the last bit that you just sort of described. And I'm interested at the individual level. Do I want to go here? Whatever. We'll cross paths, I think. But you discussed. I'll stick with the analogy. You discussed the party. One person was just going to leave. I mean, they needed to leave for some reason, and there was somebody with some temptation to leave, yet trepidation because they don't want to be the one, leaving. And once somebody finally left, they say, "Oh, thank God, I can now go." And there's some sort of a cascade behind them. I do clinical work with people who have addictions, and so I'm sure you're well in the know that motivational interviewing is sort of like this, and you're playing off of the interplay that a person has in their mind already. I mean, if you're a great clinician, in my opinion, I'm very Rogerian, I guess you'd say, then you're not doing anything heroic or profound. You're creating a space for that person to have that internal dialogue, but sort of out loud in a way that maybe they have not articulated before. And their internal dialogue, in that sense, me as the clinician sort of supervising this dialogue or guiding it in one direction or another, is sort of the job of that guy at the party, except giving that individual who was about to leave but didn't want to a little bit more agency in that decision, rather than I'm doing it because somebody else did. I'm doing it because I think I've worked this out now. So I think that it sounds like a social cascade is neither good nor bad. It's just a phenomenon.
Correct. Yeah.
But there's a way that you could think about it in terms of creating some sort of social cascade with epistemic rigor.
I love you're talking about motivational interviewing and Rogerian therapy. I studied Rogerian therapy before I switched to journalism. That's why you can totally tell in the book that I've
for sure.
Because that's why I got so excited by all these different organizations that I met: deep canvassing, street epistemology, smart politics, and others. They employ motivational interviewing, though they weren't really aware that that's what they were doing.
Right.
Which is because motivational interviewing is also something else. Like these are all examples of X. And X is a certain way of engaging another human being to there are two German researchers who labeled this whole category as technique rebuttal versus topic rebuttal, where the Socratic method is another example of technique rebuttal, where you open a space for the other person to introspect and to metacognate. And I know I'm preaching the choir here. You're an expert. I'm not an expert. I'm just a person who talked to two experts like yourself. But I found it very exciting that all these different groups had not met each other, were not aware of the therapeutic models that they were sort of recapitulating. They were not aware of the underlying psychological literature that would explain why this would be effective. They weren't even aware of terms like reactance, which is such an important term in that world and a thing to avoid. I even spent time with conflict and like professional negotiators and conflict resolvers who get employed to work in professional domains. So they use the same stuff. They talk a lot. They know about avoiding reactants and things like that. They have a different terminology in their world, but that's because they've all co-discovered something. It's one of those great things in science where, like, if you're trying to build, I say in the book, if the first person to build an airplane, it was always going to look like an airplane because they're dealing with the same issue, physics on the Earth and gravity and such, wind resistance. If you were trying to develop a conversational technique where a person could, you could avoid arguing with them, but also achieve change, it would have to work a certain way to go along with the way brains make sense of anything. And the way the way brains interact whenever they are in a conversational dynamic, being careful about not being misled, being careful about not losing agency. And yeah, this I feel this what you're saying is so exciting to me because it was the idea that all these people were finding this on their own because they were all frustrated with the world in which we're living, which is this new world of information exchange and grouping up and group identities and all. That they just A/B tested thousands of conversations and threw away what didn't work, kept what did. And they ended up recreating motivational interviewing, but in a different format, a way that you could take out of the clinical environment and do one-on-one at someone's front door at Thanksgiving or something. And then, yeah, you aren't copy pasting anything out of yourself into the other person. You're asking questions in a certain way and holding space in a way where they write their own counter arguments. And those counter arguments are new, they're fresh. They're something that has been newly built from within. And those counter arguments can start to balance the scales and they can reach a certain state of ambivalence, or they can tip the scales in a way where they feel like I may need to update the way I think about this. And I find that absolutely incredibly compelling. And if you just do that with people door to door, you can also create these widespread cascade effects.
Which I think is so interesting. So I see this, let's see, this method for engaging people. Think about it in 3 tiers, and whenever there's a finite number, there are probably more. But in terms of what you wrote about, there's like a therapeutic method where there's a tacit understanding before having these conversations that somebody is sort of ripe for change, like wants to change in some direction. So that in a way, that's kind of easy. It shouldn't be totally easy, but to make space for somebody who already wants to change, and you're kind of trying to tease out, what is it that works for you, what is it that doesn't. That's oversimplifying. You were talking about, what is it called, social canvassing,
deep canvassing.
Deep canvassing. I'm sorry, deep canvassing. There's a whole chapter on it, and I see that like you just described. It's like, how do I hold space for somebody so that I don't mess up their self-conception, sense of self, and also maybe influence change. And so there's a little driving force underlying that, but it still follows the same sort of rules. You're holding space for a person. You let them articulate. You don't shame them or chastise them for believing what they believe. You assume that they have reasons for believing it that are more or less good. I'm a person, you're a person. And then there's I'd love to talk more about street epistemology, a la Anthony Magnabosco and the book that Peter Boghossian wrote. But Anthony really as the active street epistemologist, I'd say. And I think he's fascinating because he takes a more neutral lens. It's not like, he doesn't necessarily need to change anyone's mind. He's not trying to do that. He doesn't assume that somebody is coming to him with an interest in changing. So there's no really value put on that except just understanding how a person got to their beliefs. Whatever happens from there happens. It's just the metacognition required to interrogate one's own beliefs.
I love that. I remember saying to Anthony, he was like, I don't care if they change their mind or not. I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. I want to help them understand what methods are they using to arrive at confidence. And if I want to help change, and I was like, well, that's you're changing their mind more than any of the other things. Actually, if you're changing a person's epistemological framework, that's a deeper change than changing beliefs, attitudes, or values. You're changing the thing that
the mechanism. Right.
That generates certainty and our attitudinal, valences. So street epistemology, deep canvas. I opened the book with deep canvassing, which is they went door to door in Los Angeles, 17,000 conversations, A/B tested until they arrived at a technique, and the technique is very similar to motivational interviewing. Street epistemology does share many qualities with motivational interviewing, but they're more about fact-based claims and how we arrive at our levels of certainty or confidence. Similar, and it's the same thing with them. They've done thousands of conversations and A/B tested, and they have a really strong community of people who interact with each other and sort of debrief each other on what they did in their conversations and what they could have done better. When I spent time with Anthony, I actually visited him several times. And one of the times I did the oldest journalism trick in the book, which I'd never actually done before. I hid in a bush while he was talking to people on campus in San Antonio. I shared one of his AirPods, and
I remember reading that. You said so calmly, because I was listening to the book. You said, and then I jumped out of the bush, and I was glad I had the AirPod.
Yeah, I love understating weird stuff. Yeah, it was a wild moment because there were like people they were setting up a band, and there were people in tuba wearing tubas and stuff. With that technique, and this is something you can apply to yourself or to anyone like immediately, and you only need to remember 2 of the steps, although there's 9 steps in total, but there's the only 2 that you really need to remember are the first 2, or I guess I'm taking out a couple. Here are the 2 that I say you should always remember, but I'll tell the rest. You open by establishing rapport, which is in clinical terms or psychological terms, setting up a framework where you're avoiding reactance is what you're really doing. You don't want to be the entity that generates the reactance in the other person. Reactance being whenever, and I'm sure I'm not explaining this to you, I'm just saying this to the audience. I know you know.
Oh, that's totally fine. You can, okay. Yeah, whatever.
The psychological literature is pretty robust that it seems to, in that it was pretty much going to happen if a brain, I like to say brain, or a person, a human mind entity thing, if it experiences what it interprets as a stimulus that is threatening its agency or its sense of freedom, or its threat to itself or self-identity, they will respond with what they call motivational arousal to avoid the stimulus or reduce its impact. What that means is if somebody feels like they're being shamed or ostracized, or they're being told you shouldn't think that, in fact, what you should think is what I'm going to tell you should think, or what other people think you should think, people will push back or they will walk away. They will get angry. It happens to you. You don't even have no control over this. It's not by choice. You get angry and you want to get out of the conversation. You want the other person to go away. You're trying to avoid that at first by building rapport. They build rapport by just openly being transparent and saying, I would like to explore one of your beliefs if you're into it. It's a thing called street epistemology. It's going to be in a couple of steps. They just totally are open about what's going to happen and give the other person a chance to agree to take part. And they say at any point in time, you can walk away from this. It's only going to be a few minutes. Person gets buy-in and they're like, yeah, okay, I'll do that with you. Then you, in the actual street epistemology, you ask for a specific claim. They usually say, is there some sort of belief that guides your behavior in some way? And we could explore that. It could be anything. And then sometimes people say karma or things like that, or I believe aliens have visited Earth, that sort of thing. And then you make sure you repeat the claim back in your own words and try to see if you're summarizing it properly. This is all from Rogerian stuff. Actually, you're reflecting and you're paraphrasing, and then there's also a lot of other methods that use this sort of thing. Where your Rappaport's rules is another example of this, where you're saying you're trying to be the lawyer for their side. Am I stating your case even better than you would? This allows the other person to really feel heard, and we all want to feel heard and validated. And then you're also moving the dynamic now, where you're going to be on their, it's not going to be in their brain on their side. I'm just here to facilitate, and they're getting a sense of that. Then you clarify all their definitions. Make sure you use their definitions and not yours, and it's very important. You can have a conversation about something, and you may not know that you're not having the conversation you think you're having because you're defining things differently. When I say politics, I may be thinking of a civics textbook version of it. You may be thinking of a smoke-filled room where reptiles in suits are talking about they're going to divide up the country over golf. Like, we need to be on the same page as to what the definitions are. Then this is the most important part. Then you ask for a measure of their confidence on a scale from, some use 0 to 10, some use 1 to 100. But this is the most important part of the whole thing. And if I was suggesting you only took 2 things away from it, build rapport to avoid reactance and use this scale technique, it's amazing. There are many reasons why the scale works. One reason is if it's a very touchy topic and the scale indicates they hold an attitude that other people consider questionable and you don't react poorly to it, they will continue the conversation. The other reason it's important is because it takes it out of the binary framing. I believe this, I don't believe this, is way different from saying I'm about a 7.
Mm-hmm.
And then that also introduces metacognition time, because the next thing you're going to ask is, okay, you're about a 7 on this issue. Why does that number feel right to you? Why 7? This is an incredible conversation that most of us never get to have about anything. Like I just watched The Righteous Gemstones, and you asked me what I think of it on a scale 1 to 10. I'd be like, most episodes about a 7, some of them a little better, some a little worse. Why a 7? Well, and I can feel myself about to elaborate and create arguments for and against that I've never thought of before. And then if you want to get into motivational interviewing stuff, you could say, especially if this involves like an intent to behave in a certain way, you're 7, how come not a 6? How come not a 5? Or the other direction, depending on which counter arguments you want to produce. It's incredible what you can do with this number scale once you employ it in the conversation. Then you can just leave it at that if you want to. That's a good conversation. But in street epistemology, they go a couple of steps further. They ask, what reasons do you have to hold that level of confidence? Which is basically what I'm saying now, with like, where are these numbers coming from? This is important because psychology is I'm a big advocate of talking about the introspection illusion, and oftentimes, and justification in general. And the interactionist model is all about this too. It's very easy to come up with reasons.
Sure.
But those reasons are most often at first merely justifications. And justifications are, in other words, reasons that we come up with are arguments and propositions that we feel that other people would look upon and consider reasonable. And those are usually pretty biased and lazy things at first. And we're trying to say what we think the other person wants to hear until but in street epistemology, I say, okay, that's great. But let's explore, what method are you using to determine that was a good reason to hold that level of confidence? So we've bounced 3 levels in the processing chain back. And this is thrilling to experience. If the person is really in on this with you, like you're like how come that's like what process are you using to arrive that was a good reason for you? And this is where the epistemology comes in. And oftentimes people will realize, oh, I'm using real weak reasoning for that. I'm really using a real weak method. And that's all they really want to do in street epistemology, is show you, wow, I'm using weak methods. I'm just doing this because I want to feel this. I wonder why I want to feel this. Oh, I must have other motivations I never considered. And you let all that happen on their side. You never have to say it out loud. They can keep it private even. And then you listen, you repeat, you summarize, and you wrap up, you leave. That's street epistemology, and it is incredibly effective. And it's not dissimilar from the other techniques we've talked about, but that one is very pointed in sort of like belief space. And it's pretty wild. They keep refining it and they keep doing it, and it's amazing to watch.
I'll create another category here. There's in the work that I do, part of it is researching about addiction and how people overcome it. Now, like I heard your interview with Dr. Drew Pinsky.
Oh, yeah.
And, he had this idea that, well, I also use motivational interviewing. It's been in the literature forever. And, it's part of my job is, how do I get this person thinking about, well, I should, get treatment or go to rehab. Interestingly, I broadened that somewhat. If you look at data about trends of how people overcome addictions and to which drugs and things like that, well, people tend not to get addicted. Most people don't. I'll just talk about drug. I expanded to more than drugs. Most people who do most drugs don't become addicted to them. They try them, or they use them with some intention and purpose, and it fulfills that intention. For the people who run into problems, it's like 10, 20% or something like that, based on the government's own data. Most of them grow out of their addiction at some point without any kind of therapy, which, does that render me useless? I don't know. But what I'm saying is that there is a way that people change, individuals change, and perhaps, like you're inferring, there's a way that things change in society that just, if you want to influence it, you better be sure that your influence is better than just leaving it alone. So like you could do something like street epistemology and poison the well. It'd be doing something that you think is like street epistemology, but be at some point jabbing at them. Or there's even like an attitude you could have. You could be doing the framework of street epistemology, and on paper you could be doing all of the things that you just said, except presenting yourself as some sort of a threat, or some sort of argumentative person, or making it obvious just by body language or tone that you're. So I'm interested. You mentioned three ways that people can influence minds, and Anthony Magnabosco in street epistemology's case, get people to think about the mechanism by which they form beliefs. And all of those ways seem not just logical, but they hold space for humans to be humans. And, both parties are saying, I have my downsides. I probably don't know everything. I use heuristics. I'm sure you do too, even though that's not the spoken part. Let's explore this. Are there better and worse ways to use these techniques, or better or worse times to use them? Or are there certain situations where they would be more palatable to people, or less? If you know what I mean. I think I'm not asking this question perfectly.
That's okay. That started coming up for me early on too. Like I wanted to know, by my estimation, could bad people use these things to do bad things? Or should I be using this? Should I just be using this at all times with everybody? Hey, let's talk about what you think, feel, and believe.
My interest too is that, and can good people be using these techniques for bad outcomes that are contrary to.
I early on in the book, because there was a chapter in the book about coercion that we took out late into the process, because I spent a lot of time with people in the world of cult deprogramming, which is completely debunked and pseudoscientific, and is actually mostly just kidnapping people and saying, if you do what I ask you to do, you can have this sandwich. Bad and illegal. I even spoke with the founder of cult deprogramming, who he's a very elderly man now, who is very problematic. I'll just leave it at that. So I wanted to make sure I talked about that. This is not coercion. This isn't brainwashing. Also something that's debunked and not an actual scientific thing. It's not manipulation or coercion, because only in the sense that I'm encouraging you to think more deeply about what you think, feel, and believe, and you're choosing whether or not to update. So I will make sure that that's where we're at. But on my end of the thing, or the person who's employing all this, I had a step 0 in the book, which is ask yourself why you want to do this. Is there something good here? There's a story in the book that I promised the person who is mentioned in that part of the book that I wouldn't repeat this in interviews, his story. But there's a portion of the book where I choose not to use the technique in a situation where I felt like it would do no good. I learned something from the conversation more than I brought to the conversation. And I felt like that was the point of the conversation, because sometimes if you do this properly, you're doing the same thing to yourself. And I'm going from being a face-off situation to shoulder, and we're investigating something together, and we're starting to Venn diagram each other. And by seeing your perspective better and you seeing my perspective better, we're both understanding ways in which we both aren't seeing this properly. And there's a third way to see it. There's 5,000 ways to see it, but there's at least another way. And I would recommend that is you go into the conversation hoping to learn something yourself, and you're not trying to get at, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm trying to get at, why do we disagree, if it's something we disagree about? And there's something in learning why we disagree that could lead to a much deeper or higher truth, depending on which way your metaphors like to look at the world. I highly advocate for that. And there's something Will Storr told me that I keep proselytizing this. I think it's a great thing to do for yourself before you get into these conversations, which is, here's the thought experiment / self-talk practicing. ask yourself, if we're talking about a specific topic, make it specific. Am I right about everything? And if the answer is, well, no. If the answer is yes, and this is a joke, everyone. I've said this before and people did not understand I was joking. If the answer is yes, go into politics. But if the answer is no, I don't think I'm right about everything. Then ask yourself, what am I wrong about?
That's it. It's perfect. Yeah.
And if you answer, well, I don't know, which of course you have to say I don't know, because if you knew you were wrong, you stop being wrong. So I don't know. If the answer is I don't know, then ask yourself, why don't you know? And what can you do to change that? And please do that for yourself on that specific topic before you get into a conversation where you think you're going to jump off the top rope and people's elbow somebody. That should not be the goal. The goal should be, why do we disagree? Why do I hold this so strongly? You see it so strongly. What's the matter? What's the nature of our disagreement? And you'll be much more likely to stay in a very ethical space that I advocate for.
That's Brett. I taught a civics class, high school civics class for a while, and I actually used that as something like that. And what a student described to me was, when I asked, "What did that do for you?" He said, "Well, it kind of made me feel like the lights just got turned out on me." And he said, "I assume the effect you want is for me to start thinking about, the areas in which I could be wrong and start having humility, but it made me really just want to turn the lights back on really quickly."
Yeah, of course. Of course, that free fall feeling is the reason we resist changing our minds on everything.
That's a good test, an acid test, to see can I justify using this technique on somebody? If you can ask yourself that question that you just posed, and then be okay with that uncertainty of, well, what am I wrong about? Then, and feel okay about that and go into the conversation curious, you're probably a likely good candidate for having the conversation. Mm-hmm. If you can't, and if you just want to reduce the dissonance right away, then you may second guess that.
Yeah. And there's good research in it. They call it causal narratives, where if you I can't remember his name, but he told me that if you knock the table leg out, you have to put another leg in its place. So if you're having a conversation where the person loses some aspect of their causal narrative, you have to give them something. You have to give them an opportunity to put something in its place before you continue. Because in the absence of good reasons, we'll be totally okay with bad reasons. We just need a reason. Otherwise, the structure falls. And
load bearing.
Yeah. So that's something to remember too. Like that light goes out feeling is often because, like, okay, well, you didn't give me a tool to use now that you've taken away this. Like, help me, like, give me some sort of way to rebuild my structures. Otherwise, I'm just going to go, never mind. I'm happy believing and feeling the way I felt before.
Well, I just did a romp through, and not in any sort of order through your book, and I certainly didn't do justice to the overall narrative, but I really appreciate you coming on and talking about all of this. And if there's one chapter that I am now kicking myself for not discussing with you, it's the Westboro Baptist Church chapter, which is interesting. And I think I recall you did something about that on your podcast, that You Are Not So Smart podcast.
Yeah, I had Megan on the show from that episode, from that chapter. But that chapter is all about why people onboard into those groups and what it takes to offboard a person. And the very short version of, to offboard it, they need to have someone from another community be a compassionate, non-judgmental listener who shows them that their values that they hold, that are very close to their identity, could be affirmed in another community. And that gives a person the opportunity to question different aspects of the community they're within. And that is usually the crack that lets in the light, as I say in the book. It gets more complex than that, but that is something I talk about when it comes to conspiratorial communities and cults, pseudo cults, and so on. Yeah.
Well, people have to read the book to find out more, I guess. But it's why minds change. And I note that you smuggled in some discipline and humility into the title, because it's not how to change people's minds or
I deeply resist people's mind.
It's in general, and you include yourself in that mix. And I
remember I met Simon. I talked to Simon Sinek on the phone late in the process, and he was like, "You should call the book How to Change People's Minds." I'm like, "That's not what the book's about. The book's about how minds change. I don't want it to be about how to change people's minds. That's not the idea behind it." And he's like, "Well, it'll sell better the other way." I was like, "Well, you're right, but it really isn't the book." But then he also said, "Well, look, you currently open the book with, I was doing this, or I was thinking that." People don't like that. include the audience. So I actually did change it. The book actually now starts with, "We are about to go on a journey together." That was Simon Sinek's input, and I deeply appreciate that.
And you could have said, Simon Sinek told me. No, thank you again so much. I'm a huge fan. It's no matter who I talk to and how often, it's always interesting when I get deep into somebody's work to talk to them face to face. And it's been a cool opportunity.
No, this is the best. I love what you're up to. And please stay in touch. I would be really interested to hear more about your insights into addiction and motivation interviewing and so on.